Hi there. This PowerPoint is designed for IB history students studying the history of Africa and the Middle East for paper 3, and this is part of the unit on the Middle East since 1945. We're going to look at the consequences of the Six-Day War. Just a reminder, if you have a look at the link there, there's a pretty useful, quick couple of minutes overview from Al Jazeera on the events of the Six-Day War. And just remember really that both sides are absolutely stunned by Israeli success, including the international community as well in that. Kind of furious and angry in August, and kind of bewildered as well, in August, September 1967, Arab leaders get together in Khartoum, in the capital of Sudan, and they kind of resolve a pretty drastic negotiations over Israel, with the three no's coming through now as a kind of unified Arab thought policy: no peace, no recognition, no negotiations with Israel. Within that, though, a couple of months later, the United Nations has moved on, and the international community is generally ready to accept some kind of move forward, and that will include eventually the Arab states as well. The UN Resolution 242 is put forward by the British, and in general, although Israel's success has been resounding, there's probably a large amount of international support for Israel at this time. Despite the challenges in the negotiation and in the wording, and you do need to be familiar with it for paper 3 higher level, Resolution 242 sets the Arab-Israeli peace process in motion and will form the basis of many of the later agreements, including the 1979 Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty, the agreements with Jordan, and later on, of course, the Palestinians as well in 1988. So it's a really important document. The good news is that it's pretty short, and there's a couple of key things that you need to pick up from it. If you look at the link at the top there, that takes you to a United Nations brochure about the Resolution 242 and the wording. I've just highlighted there one of the preambulatory clauses, and the Resolution 242 emphasises that it's not okay for a state to acquire title to territory by conquest. That isn't new to Resolution 242. That idea had really been growing in the international diplomacy since the 1920s, but it's stated very clearly here that it's not okay to get territory through war. Second of all, then, the wording is really very challenging, and it's the wording in particular, and that idea of territories or the territory, which proves to be a sticking point. And of course, you might notice there that there is some ambiguity there, and this kind of idea about which is going to come first: peace and sovereignty and recognition, or Israel withdrawal from territories. So the resolution takes into account the language sensitivities and the challenges for both sides, and as I mentioned before, it really is a key landmark agreement that everybody signs onto it. Remember, Resolution 242 is about states. The Palestinians are referred to in the kind of the idea of a refugee problem, but they're not mentioned here by name. The resolution takes Israeli security considerations very much into account, but there is now the seed of this idea of this land for peace formula, that Israel will return territory in return for peace. And the fulfillment of peace with Israel is conditional on the withdrawal from the occupied territories. And so, of course, that will prove ambiguous and a continued sticking point between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab states up until this day. So Resolution 242 doesn't necessarily address some of the challenges that the Palestinians are facing, of course, because they're not even really mentioned at this time. So make sure you're familiar with Resolution 242 and also its implications. But for all its limitations and for all of the fuzziness of the language, it at least gets things started, and as I mentioned earlier, it will form a basis for peace for later on. There are other things as well that are going on. Certainly, there's a huge amount of boosting confidence in Israel. There's a geographical change in shape, and we're kind of getting back to a kind of biblical Israel. And of course, throughout the early books in the Bible, different descriptions of the land is given, but certainly the West Bank and Gaza are being seen to be part of biblical Israel. And there's a growing confidence in Israel, and perhaps a belief that the 1967 war is perhaps bringing a little bit perhaps of sort of a confidence boost and some hubris here, that they have kind of again taken on the Arab world in this surprise attack, and after 6 days they definitely had a pretty decisive victory there. So there's some real challenges going on in Israel, particularly sort of idea of sort of secular Jewish nationalism or some kind of sort of religious kind of liberation of the homeland. So there's lots of things kind of going on within Israel, and remember always to have a look at the sort of domestic political scene in Israel and how Israeli attitudes are moving and shifting at this time. Elsewhere, though, of course, Pan-Arabism as a movement has pretty much collapsed and deflated. Nasser's reputation as the leader of the Arabs has certainly taken a dent. He does offer to resign as the Egyptian leader in 1967, and his resignation is refused. So his popularity in Egypt is still pretty sound, but this is again another dent to that idea of any kind of coordination with the kind of sort of shared Arab purpose here. In terms of Jordanization, this is again a challenge for the Jordanians. Remember, they're the ones that are hosting many, many Palestinian refugees, but of course now having lost control of the West Bank, there is a dent there also where they don't have the West Bank, so they can no longer really claim that idea of kind of representing the Palestinians. And there's an increasing unwillingness in Jordan perhaps to integrate Palestinian refugees into society as there might have been in previous years. Clearly, there's a massive impact on the Palestinians, and now many refugees in the West Bank are now back under Israeli control. And it will also begin to continue that development that had grown up since 1956, that perhaps the Arab states weren't going to be able to provide the solutions that the Palestinians hoped for, and that there was a need for more autonomous actions. Okay, we've mentioned this kind of boost in sort of this sort of euphoria of the Israelis, and definitely a growing sense of confidence after 1967. As the Jordan has retreated now, the West Bank is now under Israeli occupation. The Palestinians can continue their struggle from Jordan, from the east bank of the River Jordan, and certainly King Hussein is in a challenging position here. He still wants to sort of see himself as the kind of a leader with the Palestinians, I'm going to say, and he's sort of reluctant to kind of fight them. But at the same time, the Palestinian deployment in Jordan is going to give the Jordanians a headache, and they're certainly going to be challenged by the Palestinians as they're launching attacks into Israel from Jordan. And of course, those Israeli reprisals will then come back to Jordan. There's a number of raids started by Fatah across the into the West Bank and into Israel, based from Jordanian bases. But actually, the Israeli security forces are very strong. The Israeli security, as one might expect, is pretty good. And Fatah bases are pushed back from the West Bank into the East Bank and into Jordan proper. The Karameh operation is a reprisal attack by Israelis after some Fatah has launched attacks on Israel from Karameh, excuse me. The incident at Karameh and this poster here, we've delivered miracles, is a very idea, and Karameh will become a kind of part of a sort of a Palestinian myth-making struggle. And again, you're going to have to investigate different historians and different perspectives to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on here. Israeli forces enter Jordanian territory, and they end up in a battle with some Jordanian forces, including artillery, which does inflict some losses. Within the Jordanian forces, Palestinians are involved, and there is a greater Palestinian narrative here that the Palestinians have delivered a victory against Israel, whereas perhaps the kind of unified Arab states could not. So Karameh will become very symbolic. This poster is taken from the Palestinian Poster Project, and a quick search there for Karameh will reveal to you lots and lots of different posters. And I just chose this one because of that idea of realizing miracles, that idea from where do miracles come from, and a beginning, perhaps more of an increasing religious element into the Palestinian struggle as well. So Karameh is a good example for you guys for perspectives and different points of view, and it's also a good example in showing that we must be cautious about talking about Arabs as one kind of monolithic group, and we must look at the distinctions as well between the Palestinians and the Jordanians here. So it's another good example for that key concept in the IB for perspectives. Moving on then, and we're going to see another key shift here, which is the beginnings of the USA emerging as a kind of cradle almost for attempts to sort of bring about a peace process, and it's the US Secretary of State Rogers who begins with several initiatives in December 1969 going through to 1970. He's looking to help develop a peace based on the premise of Resolution 242, a peace which, as we've said earlier, doesn't explicitly mention the Palestinians, but of course refers to the Arab states and the Israelis. There's ideas to bring in Egypt, there's ideas to bring in Jordan as well. Egypt, the Sinai perhaps is easier to deal with in terms of sort of return of territory than, of course, the West Bank, which will be crucial, particularly with its possession of the Israeli, both Jewish and Muslim holy places. So that's also going on. And Palestinians themselves are perhaps challenged by the Rogers Plan and the Rogers Initiative. And within Jordan, then, there is increasing conflict between armed Palestinian groups and the Jordanians. And it will all come to a head in Black September in 1970. The challenges for many of the Palestinian groups that the peace process based on Resolution 242 will marginalise the Palestinians. The Jordanian army moves against Palestinians and moves against armed Palestinian groups, and Black September, of course, will later become the terrorist organisation that we associate with plane hijackings and, of course, the terrorism at the Munich Olympics. But basically, the outcome of the Jordanian attacks on the PLO is pretty drastic and pretty dramatic. Jordan itself is now a sort of safe state and secure. The PLO are defeated and expelled, and they actually have to shift. Eventually, they'll end up in southern Lebanon with their bases there. They can't. The east bank of the River Jordan is no longer open to them. The west bank, of course, is occupied by Israel. So there's no kind of area of decision, as Sousa calls it, for the Palestinian question to be settled. There aren't that many Palestinians who have settled in southern Lebanon, and by the mid-1973 the PLO will have established themselves pretty securely on bases in southern Lebanon. Of course, the Lebanon situation will only get worse and worse through the 1970s and 1980s. In the meantime, also, remember, there's a war of attrition going on between Israel and Egypt. It's across the Suez Canal. It mostly consists of artillery barrages. Israel is logistically strained. Remember, they're getting all their stuff across the Sinai as well. And Israel will use its air force as well to launch deep attacks down into the Nile Valley. The Soviet Union also gets involved. They'll send air support to the Egyptians. And this really is a war on the Egyptian home front. This is Israeli bombers are attacking Egyptian towns and villages. And again, just to keep in the back of your mind, it's another reason why Egypt will be the first country that will move towards a settlement with Egypt. There's a growing question being asked in Egypt: how long should Egypt be the kind of blood bank of the Arabs? How long should Egypt be continuing to do this struggle? And so the Rogers Initiative, this war of attrition, these things are coming together at the same time. So the last little piece of this puzzle in 1970 is Nasser's death. He dies of a heart attack on the 28th of September 1970. He's succeeded by Anwar Sadat, who was also a member of the Free Officers and is also instrumental in that Free Officer Revolution of 1952. And it will be Anwar Sadat that kind of picks up from this story and begins to move to finding some kind of accommodation with Israel that will come about in the Camp David Accords. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful.